Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Evaluating Race Equity and Family Engagement Strategies to Reform the Deep End of Juvenile Justice. My name is Jeffrey Poirier, and I am a Senior Associate in the Research, Evaluation, Evidence, and Data Unit at the NEEKC Foundation. I will serve as your moderator today. The KC Foundation's mission is to build a brighter future for all young people, families, and communities in the United States. And the evaluation you hear about today furthered that mission by helping the Foundation, and we hope the field, to understand more about transforming juvenile justice policy and practice. In terms of our agenda, I'll review some housekeeping and introduce our speakers. Then the presenters will begin with some background about the deep end evaluation and the evaluation design. Next, the presenters will share findings and implications for evaluation focused on two priority areas of the evaluation, specifically racial and ethnic equity and inclusion, and then youth and family engagement. Lastly, here at KC over the past year, we've begun to more intentionally embed equity in our evaluation practice. And this evaluation has informed our thinking. So I'll briefly discuss this and share a call to action at the end of our webinar. And then we will save some time at the end for discussion. So I'd like to take a moment to just review some important housekeeping details. We'll keep our attendees on mute throughout the webinar. And please note that this presentation is being recorded, and the recording and slides will both be available later at aecf.org. Lastly, after we hear from our presenters, we will have some time for questions. We ask that you submit your questions by entering them in the Q&A window, which you see here circled on this slide. And you'll find that window at the lower right-hand corner of your webinar screen. There you can submit a question to the panelists. And if you're in full screen mode and want to ask a question, you can return to the event window by using the drop-down controls at the top of your screen. So now to introduce our speakers, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Janine Zweig, Associate Vice President for Justice Policy at the Urban Institute. Leah Sakala, who will follow Dr. Zweig. Leah is Senior Policy Associate also at Urban Institute. And then lastly, and not least, our third speaker is Dr. Todd Honeycutt, who is a Senior Researcher at Mathematica. And now I'm going to turn it over to Janine to talk about the evaluation design.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. So what is deep end reform? Let's first talk about that a little bit. This initiative is supported by the Foundation as an extension of their Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. The Foundation looked to support specific JDAI sites to increase and extend their reach into their reform efforts to the deep end of the system. The primary vision of this effort was to continue reforms to safely and significantly reduce out-of-home placement for youth, and to do this especially for youth of color. The initiative was built on three fundamental elements. The first was to engage sites to use their data to identify issues of concern within their local systems, and to identify issues around juvenile case processing to inform their site decision-making with the goal of making data-driven reform and policy choices. The second element was to hold racial and ethnic equity and inclusion at the center of the reform efforts in the local sites. And this was with the aim of addressing any inequities throughout the system for youth of color. And the third was to advance youth and family engagement in the reform efforts. So what does the Foundation do to support sites in building this reform and addressing these three fundamental elements? Next slide, please. The Foundation provides guidance and technical assistance to sites that is tailored to sites' specific needs. This includes helping sites facilitate conversations with stakeholders throughout the system to design and advance their reform activities, and to engage in forthright and thought-provoking conversations to the benefit of the justice-involved youth. The foundation also facilitates peer-to-peer learning and collaboration. They do this by hosting inter-site in-person conferences and routine inter-site conference calls to discuss specific issues around the initiative's elements, to share ideas, and to learn from one another. They've also developed several tools and resources for sites to use to build their reform efforts, such as the Deep End Highway tool. And the foundation also supports sites in data collection and analysis to provide insight into a site around their initial situation in their juvenile justice system and to build toward the data-driven decision-making I referred to earlier. Specific reform activities include improving probation practices, such as changing probation conditions and changes to case planning practices. Other activities address better decision-making throughout the system, such as the data-driven decision-making or institutionalizing tools to standardize decision-making processes, either within the courts or within probation. Sites have worked to expand diversion efforts, such as enhanced case management or wraparound services, or embracing restorative justice program models. They've also increased community-based service options, such as developing strong partnerships with local community-based providers to establish a robust system of alternatives to court involvement for youth. And finally, sites have worked to increase the ways they engage youth and family in the juvenile justice process. These activities include opportunities for youth and family to be involved in decision-making around an individual case. They've created newsletters to increase communication with families. Some sites have hosted family gatherings to build and cultivate the relationships they have between probation staff and youth and their families. And some sites support family navigators, where folks work within the courts to engage with families at that point in the process, answer questions, provide resources, and generally provide support. Next slide. This evaluation is a partnership between Urban Institute Mathematica and a colleague from the University of Maryland, Doug Young. We conducted a developmental evaluation. And what is a developmental evaluation? Well, it's an opportunity for us to provide feedback to the foundation about the site activities and advancements in real time and as the initiative unfolded over time. We also were able to document how the initiative evolved as the foundation learned from the sites that were trying to implement the Deep End initiative, and as the sites learned from the foundation and their other supported providers of TA about how to develop relevant and helpful activities. And so as those learnings happening, the initiative evolved over time, and we were able to capture that. And lastly, we conducted this evaluation to share lessons with the field as we're doing so now. The evaluation was a 6-year developmental process evaluation. It involved both qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis methods. We were able to collect data starting in 2014 through the end of 2018. And earlier this month, we released a series of reports and other products that document the findings of this effort, some of which we're going to highlight today, as Jeff said. The evaluation was conducted in 12 Deep End sites around the country. 5 of those sites were part of a first cohort of foundation funding that was initiated in 2013, and 7 were part of a second cohort of funding where sites began implementing activities in 2015. Our qualitative data collection activities included regular phone interviews with local site coordinators and foundation-affiliated TA providers. We first did this on a bi-monthly basis, and then later in the evaluation switched to doing those regular check-ins on a quarterly basis. We also were able to conduct in-person site visits to Deep End sites where we conducted semi-structured interviews with a variety of stakeholders participating in the Deep End reform efforts. And we also conducted observations of particular site activities that might have been happening when we were in town, things such as community meetings that involved conversations about juvenile justice reform, or routine stakeholder meetings that were happening while we were in town. We were able to conduct 2 site visits to the cohort 1 sites during 2014 and 2015, and then again during 2016 and 2017. And we conducted one site visit to cohort 2 sites during late 2017 and early 2018. We also had the opportunity to review site documentation through work plans or other products or materials they were developing for themselves and using as part of their deep end activities. Our quantitative data collection included online surveys. We conducted a one-time survey of deep end site stakeholders in 10 sites. This included probation staff, court administrators, judges, law enforcement, prosecutors, community-based partners, and the like. This focused on probation policies and practices, elements of the site collaboration, and perceptions of the technical assistance that was being provided. Data for this survey was collected during the summer and fall of 2017. We had 242 stakeholders participate across the sites, which represented a 79% response rate. We also were fortunate to conduct 2 waves of a survey on probation policies and practices, specifically with probation staff, both frontline staff and supervisors, in 12 of our sites. The first wave was conducted in 2015 and 2016. It included 379 probation staff across the sites, representing a 72% response rate. And the second wave was conducted again in 2018, and we were able to include 332 probation staff in that survey, representing a 75% response rate. This evaluation approach that we used had several benefits, but was also subject to some limitations. We were grateful to be able to quantitatively measure change over time for probation staff through the survey to examine their progress around probation practices and policies and perceptions of probation. But we weren't able to engage directly with sites' administrative data to track change over time or to engage with youth around their own perceptions of the changes in sites or their outcomes over time. We were also able to contextualize our quantitative findings within the context of our qualitative information, which did provide us with rich context on the activities that sites were implementing from the viewpoint of multiple stakeholders in the systems. We were able to document how the initiative evolved over the course of the evaluation, but fundamentally, this evaluation prioritized process over outcomes and systems change over individual outcomes. And now I will pass the baton to my colleague, Leah Sakala, to discuss our findings related to racial and ethnic equity and inclusion.
Thank you so much, Janine, and hello to everyone who has joined us. We really appreciate you spending some of your day with us today. As Janine mentioned, racial and ethnic equity and inclusion, or REEI as it's known for short, is really central to the goals of Deep End work. And one of the most interesting and gratifying parts of engaging in this project for me as part of the evaluation team has been learning about all of the varied and creative ways that sites have pursued this goal over time. And so in this section of the webinar, I'm going to walk through some of the activities that sites have pursued as part of their Deep End work. And then I'll share some key takeaways that might be relevant for other jurisdictions engaged in similar work. And I'll conclude with some broader thoughts about looking at REEI and evaluation work more generally before passing it along to my colleague Todd for the next section of the presentation. So I'll start by going over this framework really briefly. Because there was so much variation across sites and the type of REEI work they were engaged in, we developed this framework to understand the primary types of activities based on the goals that sites were aiming to achieve. So the 3 levels here are awareness. This is activities really focused on education, staff buy-in, and ownership of shared responsibility for REEI goals. The second level is data engagement and system analysis, and this is focusing on producing and using information to diagnose opportunities for improvement and also figure out priorities for reform and measure progress over time. And then the third category here is engaging in targeted actions or policies to specific to youth of color and also that advanced engagement. Now, it's important to note that each level in this chart can certainly build on the one before it, but sites' REEI journeys were not necessarily linear, and in many places, work often happened on multiple levels simultaneously in ways that sort of reinforced each other. So I thought it might be helpful to share some specific examples of what kinds of activities we documented in each category. So I'll quickly touch on each one next. So this first category is awareness. And while committing to advancing REI is central to the process of joining the Deep End initiative. We saw that there was a lot of variation across sites in terms of their previous familiarity talking about race and ethnicity and using data to understand disparities and guide their action. And so several sites that were newer to these discussions focused really on laying a strong groundwork for future work and found particularly things like trainings to educate their staff and foster buy-in were really helpful. For example, the organization Justice for Families provided trainings to sites specifically focused on improving the engagement piece of REI. Now, some sites reported that this process could require overcoming some resistance to engaging in discussions that could honestly sometimes be tough. And things that they found useful for dealing with some resistance included using data as an entry point to really ground their discussions in more objective measures of racial and ethnic disparity in their systems. Also, using external facilitators as sort of more neutral third party to get discussions off the ground and invite people into them. And the third strategy that sites mentioned was using tools that the foundation provided, such as the Deep End Highway graphic, which is specifically designed to foster discussions about how to identify and use exit ramps on the metaphorical Deep End Highway, and also avoid on-ramps, especially since racial disparities increase the farther along the highway youth get into the deep end of the system. So these are just a few of the many strategies that we heard sites were using to get their discussions about REI off the ground. The second level is focused on data engagement and system analysis. Now, multiple stakeholders emphasize the value of using data for both launching discussions about REI and also for monitoring progress towards REI goals along the way and course correcting when needed. And so all sites are required to disaggregate their data by race and ethnicity as part of the initial system assessments when they begin their deep end work. But we saw that some sites really went above and beyond and leaned into using data as a key tool for understanding and pursuing REI. Now, some sites' data systems weren't necessarily set up to facilitate this use right off the bat. And some stakeholders reported that they needed to either make adjustments to existing data systems or generate new types of reports entirely in order to really use their information effectively. So some specific examples for data used to advance REI included systematically reviewing case files in collaboration with community partners to use this primary source data to take a deep dive into what's going on in terms of youth case processes and identify trends and opportunities for improvement. Other sites really decided that they needed new performance measures that better aligned with their REI goals. And other sites really focused on using data as a communication mechanism to share reports widely among staff on a regular basis to ensure that everyone was aware of progress and could participate in discussions about opportunities to improve. So this is really speaking to normalizing a culture of data sharing and centering REI metrics within that. The third level, as I mentioned, is really focused on actions. Now, when our data collection period ended in 2018, a subset of sites had reported engaging in concrete actions that they specifically described as related to advancing REI goals. And among those sites, there was a lot of variation, really depending on the unique needs and assets in each site. So specifically for the equity part of REI, these strategies really aim to reduce the number of youth of color in the deep end of the juvenile justice system. And there are several examples of this, but one I wanted to share was the Stress Pass program that was implemented in Bernalillo County in New Mexico. And there, stakeholders were noticing really high and concerning rates of supervision violations specifically for absconding among Latino youth in their system, which often resulted in detention. And actually, based on the suggestion of a youth in their system, they designed a program that identifies a safe place for youth to go if they need to leave their homes for any reason without being at risk of a violation for absconding. And actually, because this idea initially came from a youth, it also illustrates the second type of REI strategy, which is specifically focused on inclusion. And by this, we really mean bringing youth and families into deep end reform discussions that both speak to the system as a whole and also making sure there's close involvement in specific case decision making. And my colleague Todd will speak more to inclusion work in the next section. So while we gathered really detailed information on the activities and perspectives that sites were engaged in from our qualitative data analysis, as Janine mentioned, the survey data really allowed us to gather complementary quantitative measures that capture both self-reported activity and also stakeholders' perspectives on deep end work. And there's a lot we could say about the survey data because we have a lot of information, but I'll just highlight one finding here. And so this question really refers to, comes from the stakeholder survey, and we asked them both about how committed their leadership were to addressing racial and ethnic disparities, and also whether their leadership had conducted specific activities to advance those goals. And so looking at the blue and the purple portions of this bar graph, which is the agree or strongly agree answers from the question, we saw that nearly 3/4 of respondents reported that they agreed or strongly agreed that their leaders were committed to addressing racial and ethnic disparities, while about 60% reported that they agreed or strongly agreed that their leaders had engaged in specific actions to address disparities. And this shows that, most of the sites were actively engaged in this work, but also that there are challenges associated with moving to the activity stage of REEI work, even when there's strong commitment from system leaders. So to overview a few takeaways from all of the data collection that we did, the first one is that this is hard work, and conversations about REEI can be sensitive, and really require a lot of upfront trust building among participants that can require both patience and persistence over time as people are invited into conversations and really build up their confidence with tackling tough issues and their trust in each other to work on it together. The second takeaway is that data can be an incredibly helpful tool for opening space for discussion and providing objective and concrete measures for an accountability for progress over time. The third takeaway is that who is involved can make a really big difference. And we saw that in sites, strong leadership and strategic staffing can really facilitate the culture change that can make a huge difference in making progress on REEI outcomes. The fourth takeaway here is that the inclusion part of REEI is critical both in terms of designing specific strategies and as part of sites' overall REEI strategies, and including stakeholders both within juvenile justice agencies and engaging in these discussions, and also far beyond juvenile justice agencies to extend to community members and community organizations to engage in really active listening both ways and foster a sense of collective responsibility for pursuing REEI goals in partnership and as a larger community. So I will conclude with just a few reflections on evaluating REEI efforts more broadly, and would be delighted to dig in a little bit more in the Q&A if participants are interested. But the first one is that we were able to speak with a lot of people through phone and in-person interviews over the course of this evaluation, and incorporated the perspectives of many, many more people through our survey work, both in deep end sites and in JDAI sites. And this was critical for informing our understanding not only about variation across sites, but also documenting variation within sites for how stakeholders understood or participated in REEI efforts. The second reflection I'd like to offer is that we found that the survey was really helpful as a more impersonal data collection approach to capture site stakeholders' thoughts on a somewhat challenging subject. That said, because the data are self-reported, it's important to recognize that the survey data we present really reflect their perceptions, and also that they might have been inclined to answer survey questions in a way that they thought was consistent with what our team might want to hear. Even so, particularly because we got survey data over time, this ended up being a really, really valuable tool for documenting sites' progress and movement. Thirdly, because we were following this initiative over 6 years, we got a really good sense of how our REEI activities can evolve over time. And it was particularly notable the role that TA can play in sparking and sustaining progress. And finally, We saw that data was really important, but capacity varied greatly, which can make a really big difference on sites' reported ability to collect information and plug it right into reform efforts. And so I will pause there and turn the presentation over to my colleague Todd to walk through our findings on youth and family engagement.
Thanks, Leah. I'd like to first acknowledge a colleague of mine, Megan Haig-Angus, as the author of the brief on which most of my part of the presentation comes from. So during this final section on the results of the evaluation, I'm going to discuss 3 approaches to youth and family engagement that emerged from our observations of site activities. I'm going to provide examples of each approach. I'm going to talk about some of our survey findings regarding youth and family engagement, and I'll conclude with some takeaways and reflections, both for those in the field and for researchers. So what do we mean by youth and family engagement? What's really the role here? By engagement, we mean that youth and families have a meaningful voice in the decision-making process at the individual case level and the juvenile justice system level. And this distinction is important. At the individual case level, we're wondering if youth have voice in their own cases, in their own lives. At the system level, we're wondering whether youth and families have a voice in system decisions. This is important broadly because engagement is a fundamental part of race equity work, which Leah just covered. Families are central to young people's development, and youth perspectives in particular might not typically be taken into account by juvenile justice system staff. Now, when we looked across what sites were doing, what activities they were developing, we identified 3 primary approaches to engagement. This emerged from what we observed. We didn't have preconceived notions here. And those 3 approaches were developing resources, involvement in decision-making at the individual level, and involvement in decision-making at the system level. Now, with developing resources, we're talking about materials to navigate the court process and connect youth and families with resources. With involvement in decision-making at the individual level, those are activities related to including youth and family recommendations on how best to handle cases, what path to pursue regarding a youth's involvement in the system. And with involvement in decision-making at the system level, those are activities such as developing family councils or advisory boards meant to provide input on juvenile justice decisions and activities and reforms. There were 9 sites that participated in our main qualitative data collection activities, and of those 9 sites, all pursued activities related to youth and family engagement, and that really underscores their importance in this work. So I'm going to walk through each of the 3 approaches that we observed in terms of activities, and the first one's resources. The idea here is that youth and families might be confused with court and probation processes, with terminology, with staff, with the pathways, and that lack of understanding may lead to some general anxiety with the process. And in response, sites developed an array of resources to support youth and families. Newsletters, for example, created periodically to provide families with resources, news, upcoming events, things that may be beneficial. Setting up gatherings like a family dinner program, which one site developed that was organized by a local nonprofit organization, provided an opportunity for families and staff, agency staff to come together, share a meal, talk about information that may be relevant, serve as a listening session for staff, provide networking opportunities for families. Family navigator programs, which Janine alluded to, those were important because they made staff or volunteers available to talk one-on-one with youth and families, sometimes in the court or right outside the court, and they could support families and caregivers, answer their questions about juvenile justice processes. It was important for youth and families to have a phone number, somebody to call, to offer guidance, answer questions. And finally, there were resource guides, printed information documenting the juvenile justice system, the role that youth and families can expect to play in these processes, and point to additional community supports and services Such information can also be useful for juvenile justice staff and community providers. The second approach involved engagement in individual level decisions. It's important to acknowledge and incorporate youth goals, interests, hopes, as well as those of family members into the case process. Bring that information into the case planning process and set goals that youth and families are interested in achieving, and as a way of promoting success for youth. I want to feature one such approach that a site developed, a team support approach. And the court created the program to support youth on probation by working with the youth and a team, an array of caring adults in their lives, to discuss the youth's strengths and needs, identify, connect to, and provide resources to capitalize on those, make plans intended to increase the youth's access to well-being and repair harm to the victim and support accountability. One strength of this approach is that the team could be leveraged before pursuing a probation violation. So if something seems amiss, bring the team together to see how the youth and the team could get back on track. The site used a nonprofit organization to coordinate meetings, and staff from that organization offered advice on effective family engagement. Third and final approach, engagement system level decisions. The core idea is that those with lived experience can provide input on needed reforms, perspectives on current proposed policies. In the disability community, which is an area that I typically focus on, there's a saying, nothing about us without us, and that should be the same here with these types of reforms. We talked broadly about youth and family councils. I want to talk about the one that one site developed in terms of a family council. It was designed to allow parents and youth with probation experience to provide input on probation practice and policy. The council includes 3 family members and 3 youth members, as well as court staff representatives. A local nonprofit community partner facilitates the council meetings, and it's led by a triad, a single family member, a youth, and a court representative. Youth members are required to be age 18 or older, have completed their court responsibilities, and have a desire to use their voices and perspectives for change. On the previous slides, I covered activities that sites pursued regarding youth and family engagement. Now I want to pivot to quantitative findings from our stakeholder survey. So we asked a series of open-ended questions on that survey, asking questions such as, what are the most important goals of your deep end reform work? In your view, what are the most important youth outcomes that you would like to see accomplished with the deep insights, and so on. We coded the responses into various categories, broad categories. We don't show all those responses, we just show 2. And those 2 responses are in the gray or green shaded bar: engaging and supporting families, improving family involvement in decision-making. The orange bar represents youth engagement. Engage, elevate youth voice, include them in decision-making. And I present this because there was a fairly sizable contrast between responses oriented towards family engagement and responses that were oriented towards youth engagement. For example, in response to the question, what are the most important goals of your deep end reform work? 18% of respondents mentioned something related to family engagement, and just 3% reported on or offered a response related to youth engagement. On the last question, what are the most important changes that your juvenile justice system needs to make for youth to be successful? The response was higher for youth. 11% of respondents mentioned youth engagement answers, but that still was not as large as responses that were centered around family engagement, 27%. So in terms of our takeaways on youth and family engagement from the evaluation perspective, one is this idea of valuing the involvement of both youth and families. We saw just in the range of activities that stakeholders had an investment in youth and family engagement, but it required planning and deliberation. It has to be intentional. This doesn't just happen automatically. Second, engaging youth and families at the individual level might be easier than doing so at the system level. We saw fewer system-level activities emerge from the sites. And one aspect to consider there is that it may be hard to keep youth and families participating in these types of activities. And third, bringing in external resources can facilitate activities related to youth and family involvement. We saw this in several of the examples that I mentioned, that it may be beneficial to leverage the knowledge, staff, connections of those outside the juvenile justice system for this work. Nonprofit organizations, family-oriented organizations, youth-oriented organizations. And the technical assistance that the Foundation provided may have been instrumental in developing these kinds of relationships and bringing these partners to the table and involving them in deep-end work. And I'll end with some reflections on evaluating youth and family engagement. First, the mixed method approach allowed us to observe youth and family participation in leaderships and work groups. We were able to check in on that work, map progress and involvement over time. Second, the interviews and material reviews provided rich data on activity development that we could see in close to real time, progress, challenges, responses to those challenges. Third, our survey data provided an alternative perspective on the attitudes related to youth and family engagement. The fourth item is probably more about us as evaluators, that looking back now on our activities, our evaluation activities over the past few years, not incorporating the youth and family perspectives, especially of youth of color, was a significant limitation for the evaluation. Just as youth and family advisory groups might be instrumental for guiding deep-end reform, what we saw on the sites, it could also be useful to help us with evaluating that reform. It's something that we didn't do, and in retrospect, wish we did. And personally, I'm looking for ways to do so for other evaluations that I'm actively involved in. And just want to also posit that this is an issue with the larger evaluation community as well. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Jeff.
Thanks so much, Janine, Leah, and Todd for those insights from the evaluation. And now, as I mentioned earlier, the Casey Foundation works to develop solutions that build a brighter future for all young people, as well as families and communities. And we really believe that when children and young people thrive and grow into successful adults, our communities are stronger and we all benefit. Now, to do this, we need strong research and data so we know what young people need and what works for their healthy development and the strength of our communities. However, we cannot achieve our mission unless we advance equitable opportunities that allow all children and families to succeed. Therefore, it's important that our evaluation practice, like all of our work at Casey, advance equity. Now, in the past, Casey and philanthropy more broadly have funded evaluations without input from those affected, including young people and other community members. But when we don't get this input, we may pursue questions that are not the most relevant and important to the people we care about, and we may not get the answers we need. So the evaluation field is evolving, and we know that now is the time to begin collecting vital information that could help us to restructure inequitable systems and also equip community members to build their own knowledge and skills in data, evidence, and how policies and programs operate. At the Casey Foundation, we have been working to implement additional practices, context, and perspectives into evaluations in ways that deepen equity. We should think about how to do this through all evaluation phases, from planning to data collection and analysis, reporting, and then dissemination and use. And for example, we should gather information and data from community members to provide the necessary context that informs an evaluation. We should establish rapport and trust with community members and stakeholders as part of the evaluation process. We should also engage community members in deciding on the right evaluation questions to ask and the best data sources and methods to answer them. We also need to answer critical questions about how historical and structural decisions have contributed to inequities. And we should measure how disparities affect different populations, in particular young people and families and communities of color. Additionally, when evaluating youth-focused programs and policies, we should explore how to engage young people themselves. This is a valuable opportunity from a youth development perspective. And these are just a few examples of how to embed equity in our evaluation practice. So as we conclude this webinar, I challenge evaluators in philanthropy to figure out how to engage community in evaluations and to build capacity so that they can fully contribute their expertise. Funders should invest in more equitable evaluation practice and should use our influence to not only strengthen our methods, but also our learning about these practices. And if we were starting this evaluation over, we would try to explore these issues much more intentionally. Now, this work is not easy, but it is necessary. And it will not happen quickly, but we need to be diligent in working to advance equity, whether as a funder, investing in an evaluation, or as an evaluator designing and conducting a study. And this work should be grounded in authentic partnership with communities, including systems, families, and young people. So it's important to note that other organizations and evaluation leaders have been working to advance equitable evaluation practices in ways that strengthen the validity of our evaluation findings. Some of these, such as the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, are shown here on this slide. And I really encourage you, if this is an area of interest, to explore some of these resources to inform your evaluation practice or your work more broadly. So as a reminder, you can enter your questions in the Q&A window, which you see here on the bottom right. And we will now move into some discussion. And it looks like we have one question that's been entered. The question is, within the areas reviewed, did any have a state court designated worker program within their juvenile justice systems? It looks like, Leah, do you want to, or does anyone from the evaluation just want to comment on that?
Jeff, this is Todd. I'm not aware of any that did, but I don't know that that's actually accurate. It's not something we picked up on as part of the evaluation. So it could be that they were engaged with that, but it's not something that we observed.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Let's see, I'm just trying to expand my question window. It's a little small. So another question is from Danielle Lepeau, who's at the Casey Foundation and has really been leading the Deep End work during this time. And her question is, or comment is that the foundation began this work with a frame that emphasized 6 cross-cutting values, including family engagement, but not including youth engagement. Do you think that helps explain the youth-family engagement data that you showed?
No, I'll start this, but Leah and Janine, if you have anything you want to add here. Possibly, that's an interesting idea. You know, one of the things that was important for this work was that the foundation, the reform itself evolved over time. So what the foundation emphasized at the very beginning, you know, drifted a little bit, though I think the core point was still the same. And it could very well be that that emphasis on family engagement over youth engagement did influence the responses that we received based on the qualitative. Though I would also say that the foundation, you know, did emphasize that youth engagement piece by the time we asked those questions, and but it just may have had it may not have had diffused through the whole stakeholder community that was involved in the Deep End work and that were responding to the survey questions.
Thanks, Todd. And I see another comment here, and it's relative to the finding that it's more difficult to have youth families engage at the systems level. And the question is, what did you find in terms of sites compensating youth families? Is it happening? And if so, have you gotten a sense of how attractive the compensation was?
I think they did pay. I'm not sure what the level of that payment was. Janine or Leah, do you have more information about that aspect?
I do not have specific information about payment amounts.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I don't have a ready answer for that.
And then I think there's a clarifying question about the quantitative data on sites engaging families more than youth. Let's scroll back down and just jumped. How are the response options organized? Selecting one, selecting all that applied, ranking?
Here we're showing simple frequencies. And when we coded up the answers, individual or respondents could have more than one response, and we coded each response. So we look at it at the respondent level, not the response level, and we didn't do any ranking. We just, is it mentioned or not? That's what we're showing here. And just to be clear, respondents could have more than one response here to these questions.
Thanks, Todd. I see some other questions. I'm not sure if this is the space for them, whether the evaluation had data around them in terms of, for example, regarding family engagement. What about those youth whose family, whenever another comment comes in that scrolls back up to the top. What about those youth whose family environment is unsafe, is the comment. I don't know if the evaluation team has anything to comment on that. And also there's a comment, did the sites collect race and ethnicity information in the same way and at the same decision point?
I'd be happy to jump in. This is Leah on the question about race and ethnicity data, because I think it's a really important one. And I think the answer is that when sites initially joined the deep end work, there was a lot of variation, but as part of the system assessment process, the foundation and the technical systems providers work with sites to collect some really fundamental baseline metrics across their system, and there's a requirement that those metrics are disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And so some sites were really, in a pretty strong position to produce that information pretty quickly, and some sites really took a little bit longer time with some coaching and assistance to get their data systems up to speed to collect those baseline metrics required for the system assessment. But then additional sites went above and beyond those baseline metrics to really dig into their data a little bit more and try to parse some of the nuance. So I think the short answer is that there are baseline metrics that are required as part of the initial system assessment process, and then some sites chose to really go farther with the data that they were collecting and using to do their REEI work.
And then regarding the other question around family environments being unsafe, at least one site did directly address this through ensuring that there was a number of community-based alternatives to not placing someone in a detention or a correctional setting, but instead finding other community-based alternatives, including kinship care and respite care and things like that as alternatives for youth.
And just to build on that answer, I think it's important, and we heard this from several site stakeholders, that the word family can be interpreted really broadly to include any caring adults or caregivers in a youth's life, whether or not they are sort of their immediate family members or just other caring people in their life. And they were really aiming to invite the youth's inner circle and the caring adults in their lives into the justice reform process, including for case planning purposes. So I think that's a really important flag specifically about that word and how sites were interpreting it in terms of involvement and engagement.
Thanks. And another question came in about the diversity of probation staff, and the question is whether the evaluation looked at that in any way, and sort of came with a comment that as juvenile justice reform efforts are underway across the nation, it's important for us to also understand the racial ethnic composition of staff in probation, diversion, et cetera, who have similar lived experiences of the youth entering the systems.
So we did try to understand the diversity within probation staff as part of our survey questions that we asked. And we also did try to understand the extent to which individual probation staff persons' race or ethnic identity influenced their perceptions of probation practices. And we weren't able to distinguish differences in probation practices based on these metrics. But we do have a journal article that is also part of our suite of products that's available to review that specifically looks at the changes over time in perceptions of probation and policy practices for probation staff and for the surveys that we conducted in the communities.
And this is Lee. I'd just like to quickly jump in as a follow-up to the question on race and ethnicity data collection to highlight a comment in the chat from Danielle Lepeau, who's part of the core Deep End team at the Foundation, noting a really important point about how there is some variation in the specific categories that sites collect for race and ethnicity. Because there is no single quote-unquote correct way to collect these data, there's a lot of variation. So the important thing is to collect it and understand what you're collecting, and then based on that particular methodology, figure out the most rigorous way to use it and to fuel deep end reform, including for calculating involvement and different differential rates. So thanks for lifting that up, Danielle. Appreciate it.
And I'm going to ask a burning question that I have, which is, if another research evaluator were conducting a similar study focused on either race equity or family engagement, what would be your top recommendation to that evaluator?
So from my perspective, I think it would be great to conduct an evaluation that engaged youth and family members directly, both to inform the evaluation design and the research questions being asked, to ensure that what we were studying was most important to them and would be most influential in their experiences with these systems, as well as to gather information about outcomes from those individual sources.
Thanks, Janine. Todd or Lee, anything you want to add to that? And I'm going to check the chat box and see if anything else came in before we wrap up in a minute.
Leah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with Janine, and then just add that one thing that really strengthened our evaluation was just the sheer range of stakeholders that we spoke to who were involved in reform in different capacities. Lots of people within agencies, but also lots of people outside of juvenile justice systems who were engaged in this process as part of the deep end reform goals. We got a lot of rich information that we wouldn't have gotten if we had just spoke to people who were kind of closest within juvenile justice system agencies.
And I would add, I guess similar to what Janine was saying, is that idea of getting youth and family voices in evaluation design. What are the right questions to ask? What are the right activities that could be informative?
And I think the last question we have time for is around youth and family engagement directed at the system level. Were there any recommendations or insights on how to build and, more importantly, sustain this engagement? And I think I'll just jump in and say that your suite of products, which you might want to briefly describe, is a place for people to go to following the webinar. Is that right, Todd? Yeah, that's right. So we have a report that talks broadly about the findings from the evaluation, describes the activities for the sites, talks about challenges, facilitators to the work, and then we have individual or smaller briefs on race and ethnicity, equity and engagement, on data collection, which was a key part of the work on engaging youth and families. That's where you can get more information, and then from the there's also more information about the work on the Foundation's website. That's it right there. So that would be a way to do that. So in terms of, are there specific things that about keeping youth and families engaged? I don't know that we have good information about that. It is at that systems level piece. It was something that was less frequently, as I mentioned, it was a less frequently pursued activity, at least in terms of implementation. Then it's tricky work to do. So I don't know that we had enough information to say what the things are that are better at facilitating those pieces. Thanks, Todd, and thanks to Janine and Leah as well, to the three of you for an engaging presentation on the deep end evaluation and its implications for evaluation practice. And as you see here on this slide are two links. The first is to the suite of products that Todd just described that were sort of the key result of this evaluation in terms of trying to inform and influence what happens in the field around this work. And then the second is a really valuable resource around like Casey's perspective and recommendations around how to lead with race to reimagine youth justice. And that's a really valuable brief that I recommend you look at to better understand Casey's perspectives and ideas in this space. And also, not on the slide, I'd point to jdiconnect.org if you're not familiar with that. That's the virtual space for the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. A really great space to engage with other professionals and network, and also to talk and find resources. So some of your questions and ideas, that would be a great space to lift up and connect with juvenile justice folks from around the country. So I encourage you to check that out as well. And just as a reminder, as we wrap up, thanks to all of you for joining. I hope you found this to be interesting and useful to your work. And the recording and the slides both will be on the Casey website following today. So thank you everyone for joining, and I really appreciate your time this afternoon.